Why did the silence feel louder than the gunfire? Inside the forward operating base, no one spoke. The room was lit only by the cold glow of the tactical display, hundreds of blue dots shrinking under the swarm of red that moved across the screen like a storm. 480 SEALs, America's most elite operators, pressed into a valley they were never supposed to be trapped in. Each blue dot was a life, each one now flickering under threat of vanishing forever. "Sir," Major Kendrick finally said, his voice steady, though the weight in it carried enough to break anyone listening. "Enemy strength confirmed at 2,000. They've cut off every known extraction route. Anti-aircraft positions here, here, and here." His finger tapped the ridges circling the valley. Colonel Blackwood's jaw tightened. The muscle moved just once, a flicker of defiance against the mask he tried to keep in place. The comms line cracked with static, then the strained voice of Lieutenant Commander Riker forced its way through. "Command, this is Task Force Echo. We have 63 wounded. Ammunition at 40%. Request immediate air support and extraction. Situation critical. Repeat, situation critical." The plea echoed through the command center. Men shifted uneasily, not because they doubted Riker's words, but because they all knew what was coming next. General Wainwright's face appeared on the main screen, joining from Central Command, the weight of Washington wrapped in every syllable. "Colonel," he said, calm, almost cold, "the Joint Chiefs have reviewed the situation. The decision is made." Blackwood straightened. His silence dared the man to finish. "Task Force Echo is hereby classified as operational casualties. Strategic withdrawal authorized. All remaining assets are to evacuate immediately." The words hit harder than artillery. Operational casualties. The phrase meant one thing. The 480 were already considered dead. Rescue wasn't just unlikely, it wasn't even allowed. "Sir," Blackwood tried, voice lower, trembling with something he refused to let break free, "we're talking about 480 men." "I'm aware of the numbers," Wainwright cut him off. "And I'm aware that sending rescue forces would double those numbers. The order stands." In the corner of the room, a junior officer muttered something under his breath. No one corrected him, because everyone was thinking it. 480 men were being abandoned to die. On a windswept ridge, miles away from the command center's calm cruelty, one woman saw the truth for herself. Captain Ezra Lynn Frost, Navy SEAL, sniper, the first woman to qualify for the teams. Her gloved hands adjusted the long-range scope, pulling the world into razor focus. Through her lens, she saw the desperate lines the SEALs had thrown together in the valley below, a ring of gunfire against an ocean. She saw the red tracers cutting through the darkness, marking where 2,000 fighters were tightening their noose. And in the faintest corner of her scope, she saw lights retreating into the night sky. Helicopters, turning away. "Turning back all observation posts," the voice on her radio ordered. "Immediate withdrawal. Repeat, all personnel are to withdraw immediately. Extraction helicopters are en route to your positions." Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. Her finger lingered over the radio. She could hear the words forming in her mind. What about them? What about the 480? But she didn't say it. She already knew the answer. "Captain Frost, acknowledge withdrawal order." Her scope settled on a figure in the valley. An enemy commander directing mortar teams into position. Mortars that would tear through the last defenses within hours. Her finger brushed the trigger, featherlight. "Captain Frost, do you copy? Acknowledge withdrawal order." The crosshairs held steady. Her chest rose and fell, breath slow. The decision was no longer distant, no longer theoretical. It was one squeeze away. She took it. The rifle cracked. A distant figure collapsed. Silence on the radio, then chaos. "Delta, what was that? Did you just engage?" Captain Frost respond immediately. Beside her, Master Chief Beckett, the spotter who'd stood at her side through more missions than she could count, looked at her with eyes that carried equal parts pride and inevitability. "We're really doing this," he said softly. Her hand flicked the switch on the radio, silencing it forever. "I didn't hear anything," she muttered. "Communications must be down." Beckett adjusted his spotting scope, already falling into rhythm with her decision. Wind at 3 knots southwest. Her rifle cracked again. Another figure dropped. Her voice was calm, almost detached. "They won't send rescue with the current threat assessment." She chambered a round with a snap of steel. "So we change the assessment, one shot at a time." Hours bled into one another. Night thinned into the gray of dawn. Reports filtered back into the command center, reports no one could explain. Enemy commanders eliminated. Mortar positions silenced. Communications teams wiped out. Colonel Blackwood leaned over the screen, eyes narrowing. "What the hell is going on out there? I ordered withdrawal." Major Kendrick's eyes darted across the data feed. His voice wavered with confusion, with awe. "Sir, these shots, they're coming from multiple angles, distances exceeding 1,500 meters, precision too consistent to be luck." A comms officer lifted his head, pale, almost frightened. "We've triangulated, sir. It's Captain Frost. Observation post Delta. She never withdrew." Blackwood's face darkened, disbelief and anger mixing in equal parts. "She's disobeying direct orders. She's jeopardizing everything." "Sir," Kendrick interrupted, voice rising despite protocol, "enemy casualties are mounting. Their offensive is breaking down. She's creating confusion, making them think they're facing a larger force." On the main screen, General Wainwright reappeared. "What's this about unauthorized operations?" "Captain Ezra Lynn Frost," Blackwood said flatly. "She's refusing to withdraw." Wainwright's eyes narrowed. "Frost, why does that name sound familiar?" Kendrick pulled her file. "SEAL Team 6, Sniper Division, first female operator to qualify, most of her records redacted, unusual clearance." The general's lips tightened. He remembered, but he didn't say it aloud. Back on the ridge, Frost wiped sweat from her brow, her cheek pressed to the rifle stock. Each trigger pull was the same ritual: breath in, hold, release. Each shot erased another man who stood between her brothers and their only chance at survival. She didn't count the kills, but Beckett did. 37 by midday. In the valley, the SEALs began to notice. The fire against them eased. The noose loosened. Somewhere out there, someone was fighting for them. A single transmission cut through the chaos, her voice steady despite the storm around her. "Command, this is Frost. Created an extraction corridor on the eastern ridge. Need air support in the next 20 minutes to get our people out. Sending coordinates." The silence that followed was longer than gunfire. Then Colonel Blackwood's voice broke it, hard and unyielding. "Captain, you are in violation of direct orders. Return to base immediately." "With respect, sir," Frost answered, her rifle cracking again, another enemy silenced. "I can save them, but I need those helicopters." In the valley, Riker's broken voice forced itself onto the line. "Command, this is Task Force Echo, 42 critically wounded, ammunition at 20%, but we've identified a potential extraction point on the eastern ridge. Someone's clearing a path for us." In the command center, the words echoed, not as a plea, but as proof. Someone had refused to abandon them. Frost's radio went silent again, but her rifle kept speaking for her, one round at a time. And though she had no way of knowing it, her defiance had already begun to rewrite everything. What made her stay when everyone else obeyed? On the ridge, Frost didn't ask herself the question. She didn't need to. She knew the answer already. Because the alternative, listening to those men die while she sat in silence, was unbearable. Through the scope, she watched the valley breathe with chaos. Wounded men dragged their brothers to shallow cover. Ammunition belts ran dry. Blood darkened the soil where they fell. Every second stretched thin. Every decision weighed more than her own life. Her rifle spoke again. One shot, then another. The enemy's mortar barrage faltered, cut in half before it could ignite the valley. A commander fell backward with disbelief frozen on his face. Frost shifted her aim and found his replacement before he could even shout an order. Beside her, Beckett whispered numbers, wind, distance, adjustments. The two of them moved like one machine, practiced rhythms carved into their bones after years in shadows where no medals were promised and no headlines would ever follow. But Frost was not thinking of medals. She was thinking of men's faces, men she had trained beside, eaten with, bled with. Men who had fought shoulder to shoulder with her, some of whom had never fully accepted her presence in their ranks. But none of that mattered now. They were hers, brothers by choice and by fire. And she would not leave them. In the command center, disbelief grew like wildfire. Colonel Blackwood paced with the tension of a man trapped between duty and conscience. Every few minutes, new reports landed on his desk, enemy command nodes collapsing, sniper fire decimating the offensive, scattered radio chatter from the valley that sounded less like desperation and more like hope. General Wainwright's voice barked through again. "Colonel, contain this immediately. She is defying a direct order, and if you allow this to continue, you risk total collapse of operational discipline." Blackwood clenched his fists. "With respect, sir, she's holding back an army." "That is irrelevant. If she survives this, she faces court-martial. Do you understand me?" The colonel's jaw worked. He didn't answer right away, because deep down he knew the truth. Discipline had already collapsed, but not because of Frost, because of Washington, because of the phrase operational casualties spoken so easily by men far from the valley. He turned to Kendrick, who was still watching the screen with the hunger of a man witnessing something that history would one day deny. "Get me her record," Blackwood ordered quietly. Minutes later, the truth emerged, the ghost of Quarangle. 7 years ago, another valley, another impossible ambush. 83 Army Rangers trapped, declared dead before they were even gone, and one sniper who refused the order. One sniper who created an escape corridor out of chaos, buying enough time for helicopters to land where none should have survived. She had saved dozens then, but her story had been buried, sealed under the weight of politics and shame. They'd called it classified, but men who had walked away alive from that valley whispered another name. The ghost, the one who wouldn't leave. Back on the ridge, Frost's trigger broke again, her cheek pressed tight against the rifle stock. 38, 39. She didn't track the numbers, but Beckett did. His voice stayed low, steady. 17 anti-aircraft positions neutralized. Southeast ridge is clear. They can bring the birds in now. Frost exhaled slowly, never letting her heartbeat climb. "Then we hold until they do." Her body screamed against the hours of stillness, the bruises from recoil, the ache in her leg from an old injury that never truly healed. She ignored all of it. Pain was familiar, loneliness too. She had lived her entire career in the shadow of doubt, questioned, second-guessed, studied for flaws none of her brothers carried. But now none of that mattered. Now she was their last chance. In the valley, the SEALs began to move. Wounded men were dragged across rock and dirt, toward the eastern ridge where Frost was carving the corridor. Their commanders exchanged glances, realizing someone had chosen to fight for them. It didn't matter who. It mattered only that the impossible suddenly felt possible again. Lieutenant Commander Riker staggered to the comms, blood staining his uniform, his voice torn raw. "Command, this is Echo. Whoever's out there, tell them we see it. Tell them we're moving. We're not done yet." In the command center, the transmission silenced every voice. Men leaned forward, eyes on the board, watching as 480 blue dots began to shift, dragging themselves toward hope. Blackwood closed his eyes for a moment. His decision was already made, though the world would punish him for it later. "Launch the rescue birds," he ordered. His voice was quiet, steady. "Support Captain Frost's corridor." Kendrick hesitated only long enough to recognize the gravity of what his commander had just done. Defied Washington. Defied the Joint Chiefs. Defied the idea that 480 men could ever be called casualties before their last breath was spent. And in that decision, the war changed. On the ridge, Beckett's voice grew tense. "They've spotted us. 50 hostiles moving this way." Frost didn't flinch. "Then we buy them more time." He looked at her, his weathered face breaking through its calm for just a moment. "We won't hold against 50. That's why I'm staying." He stared, and then he understood. She was already making her peace. "Not leaving you behind," Beckett said firmly. "That's why I'm staying," she repeated softer. Her eye never left the scope. "So no one else has to." The enemy converged, black shapes against the pale light of dawn. Gunfire cracked through the rocks. The ridge shook with impact as dirt and stone burst into the air. Frost shifted, fired, shifted again. Each shot precise. Each one a delay. The first helicopters roared into the valley, blades chopping the air, their shadows stretching across the wounded being loaded aboard. Blackhawks. Too few, too fragile, but enough to carry hope. Frost whispered into her mic one last time before cutting comms. "I'll keep them off you until everyone's out. Just don't leave without a head count." Her words were almost lost under the noise, but Blackwood heard them. And for the first time in his long, hardened career, his voice cracked when he answered. "We're coming for all of you, Captain. Every single one." She didn't reply. Her rifle did. The ridge burned with muzzle flashes as she fought alone, her silhouette a single defiance against the tide. Beckett fired beside her, but she knew he was only there because he refused to leave her. Helicopters lifted from the valley, dust swallowing the sky. 300 men out, then 400, then more. Each one carried by the corridor Frost had carved through blood and defiance. And still she stayed. Still she fought. Her hands shook now. Her arm burned where shrapnel had grazed her. Blood darkened her sleeve, but she ignored it. The only thing that mattered was the next shot, and the next, and the next. By the time the last groups of SEALs staggered onto the helicopters, she was down to her last magazine. Every shot had to count. Every shot had to mean something. The world narrowed to her scope, to her heartbeat, to the sound of Beckett calling out corrections with calm that masked his fear. And in that silence between shots, she thought of one thing. Not orders, not consequences, not courts or medals. Only this: did they all make it out? How many lives can one person hold back with a single rifle? The question haunted the ridge as daylight bled across the mountains. Frost's scope trembled just once, not from fear but from fatigue. Her body had been motionless for hours, her muscles screaming for release, her nerves raw. Yet she stayed fixed to the glass, because if she pulled away, men would die. 5 o'clock. 200 meters, Beckett whispered, his tone as steady as it had been at the first shot. The spotter's calm was deceptive. He'd seen too much, knew too well how little margin they had left. Frost shifted, breath squeezed, the target collapsed. It was the same rhythm, over and over, but the weight of it grew heavier with every trigger pull. She wasn't just killing men, she was carrying 480 of her own. Every time her round struck home, another SEAL gained a few more steps toward the extraction point. In the valley, the helicopters surged, black silhouettes against the rising sun. Rotor wash whipped dust and blood into the air as wounded were hauled aboard. Men with bandaged limbs, faces caked in soot, eyes hollow but still burning. Some had to be carried. Others dragged themselves forward, refusing to die on that ground. Lieutenant Commander Riker limped toward the last Blackhawk, shoving men ahead of him. His radio crackled with Frost's coordinates, though he didn't know it came from her directly. All he knew was that someone out there was holding back the tide, and without that ghost on the ridge, none of them would be leaving. 300 extracted, the voice called into Colonel Blackwood's headset. 98 wounded aboard. Blackwood stood in the doorway of the command helicopter, his eyes fixed on the ridge line where muzzle flashes winked in the distance. He knew exactly who it was, and he knew exactly what it meant. "Sir," Major Kendrick said carefully, "quick reaction force is inbound to her position," but his voice faltered. "They might be too late." Blackwood closed his eyes briefly. He thought of the orders he had given, the ones she had defied, and he thought of what he would carry if she didn't make it home. On the ridge, the fight closed in. The enemy had realized her position. Bullets screamed against the rocks, chipping stone into her face. A round struck so close it cracked her spotting scope. Beckett cursed under his breath but stayed steady, calling out wind shifts, target ranges, anything to keep her locked in. 17 left in this mag, he muttered. Frost didn't answer. She already knew. "East slope," he said quickly. "They're flanking." She swung, fired, dropped 2. The rest scattered, but the pressure grew. Every shot bought less time. Every second tightened the circle. For the first time, doubt flickered across her thoughts. What if the helicopters lift and I'm still here? What if this ends exactly how command said it would? But then she saw them, the last line of SEALs crawling toward the extraction zone. Men half carrying each other, refusing to let the wounded fall. One paused, turning his head toward the ridge as if he felt her eyes on him. He lifted a hand weakly, not in signal, not in farewell, just acknowledgement. She set her cheek to the stock again. Not yet. The command center watched, transfixed, as impossible numbers poured in. Enemy losses mounting, anti-aircraft threats neutralized, the corridor to the east ridge opening wider by the hour. Wainwright reappeared on the feed, his voice sharp, his expression tightening. "Colonel Blackwood, you are to cease this immediately. I want every asset redirected. Frost is compromising the operation and—" "Compromising," Blackwood snapped. His voice, rough from decades of war, carried a fury the general hadn't expected. "She's the only reason we're pulling anyone out at all." Wainwright's jaw locked. If she survives this stunt, she will answer for it. Kendrick slammed a folder on the desk, his self-control gone. "Sir, you'll answer for it. Because if she hadn't defied you, 480 coffins would be flying home tonight." Silence, the kind of silence that only truth could carve. Back on the ridge, Beckett's voice broke the moment. "They're on us." Frost fired again. Empty. The bolt snapped back dry. She reached for her last magazine, slammed it home, racked the round. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear but from blood loss. Shrapnel burned across her thigh, another line of pain she hadn't acknowledged until it slowed her reload. "QRF better get here soon," Beckett muttered. "They'll come," Frost said, though her voice was fatting. Her rifle cracked again, the sound ragged, her breathing louder in her own ears than the gunfire around her. She no longer thought in minutes or seconds, only in shots. One more, then another, and another. In the valley, the final groups of SEALs reached the helicopters. Riker was still refusing to board, blood soaking through his sleeve, his face pale. "Not without her," he shouted over the roar of the rotors. "Commander," a medic argued, "we have to lift now or none of us get out." "Not without her," he repeated. Colonel Blackwood placed a hand on his shoulder. His voice was grim, resolute. "We've sent the quick reaction force. They're going to bring her home." Riker stared at him, searching for any crack of doubt. He found none. Slowly, painfully, he nodded and let himself be pulled aboard. The helicopters began to rise, dust swirling beneath them, engines screaming against the thin mountain air. And still, from the ridge, Frost's rifle echoed. By the time the QRF reached her position, the ground was littered with bodies. 50 hostiles had converged, but only fragments remained alive to flee. And in the center of the ruin, Frost knelt, rifle still pressed to her shoulder, her face streaked with dust and blood. Beckett crouched beside her, his own weapon empty, his voice hoarse from shouting corrections through the chaos. "Captain Frost," the QRF leader called out, breaking through the gun smoke. Time to go home. Her rifle lowered, finally. Did all 480 make it out? She asked, her voice cracked, thin but unyielding. The QRF leader knelt beside her, every single one. Only then did she let go. They carried her on a stretcher, Beckett beside her every step as the last Blackhawk descended. The valley behind them was scarred, burned, broken, but it wasn't a graveyard. It was an escape. When the helicopter touched down at base, an unprecedented sight awaited them. All 480 SEALs, many of them bandaged, leaning on crutches, bleeding through their uniforms, stood in formation, silent, perfectly aligned. As Frost was carried past them, they raised their hands as one. A salute, not ordered, not rehearsed, born of the knowledge that one woman's defiance had been the only reason they still drew breath. Colonel Blackwood walked beside her stretcher, his face hard but his voice low, almost broken. "Captain Frost, I owe you an apology, and my deepest gratitude." Her reply came quiet, almost swallowed by the rotors. "Just did what anyone should have done, sir." But everyone there knew it wasn't true. Not anyone would have, only her. That night, when silence returned to the mountains, Blackwood stood alone outside the command tent, looking toward the ridge she had held. His hands trembled, though no one was there to see it. For the first time in his long career, he questioned whether his obedience to orders had been cowardice dressed as discipline. And for the first time, he knew the answer. Why did the silence in the hospital feel heavier than the gunfire in the valley? Frost woke to it days later. White walls, the sharp sting of disinfectant, the rhythmic beep of monitors that told her heart was still working, even when every muscle insisted it shouldn't be. Her leg throbbed with every pulse, a jagged line of pain, permanent now. She knew it before the doctors confirmed it. She would walk again, but never without the limp. A reminder carved into her body that some choices had prices you carried forever. Beckett was there when she opened her eyes. He sat slouched in the corner, still in fatigues, his face pale from exhaustion. But when her eyes flickered open, his head lifted and the ghost of a grin tugged at his mouth. "About damn time," he muttered. Her voice rasped, "How many?" His brow furrowed, "How many what?" "How many made it out?" He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "All of them, Frost, all 480. She exhaled, slow. A tear slipped down the corner of her eye, though she didn't realize it until Beckett pretended not to notice. Relief didn't feel like triumph. It felt like collapse. 2 weeks later, they flew her to Washington, the Pentagon. She wore her dress uniform for the first time since before the mission. Medals she hadn't asked for pinned against her chest, though none of them mattered. The limp slowed her walk down the polished halls, echoing like a drumbeat. The Secretary of Defense himself presided over the ceremony. The hall was filled with rows of uniforms, brass polished, faces stiff with expectation. Cameras too, though most of what happened in Nurstan would never be shown to the public. She stood at attention, spine rigid despite the ache in her leg, as the medal was lowered onto her. The words rang across the hall, formal and deliberate. Extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds, a moral compass that pointed true when protocols failed. The Medal of Honor gleamed against her chest. She did not look at it. Instead, her eyes swept across the crowd. And there they were, all 480, filling the back of the hall, some scarred, some walking with canes, others pale from wounds that still hadn't fully healed, but all alive. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to break, Colonel Blackwood approached her. He was no longer her commander. He had already resigned. She could see it in his uniform. No insignia of authority, just the man himself. "You changed something," he said quietly. His voice wasn't that of a colonel now, just a man confessing. "How we define acceptable losses. No one will be abandoned again." Frost didn't smile, didn't gloat, she only nodded once. "See that they're not." But she knew the truth. It would take more than words in a hall to change a culture built on numbers and risk assessments. Months later, she limped onto the training field at Coronado. A new class of candidates stood stiffly at attention, salt air clinging to their skin, exhaustion carved into their faces. Among them she saw something new. Women, 4 of them, the largest number to attempt this course together. An instructor raised a patch into the air. Black background, a white number 480. Beneath it, words embroidered in silver, no one left behind. When you qualify, the instructor said, his voice carrying across the wind, you'll earn this. A reminder of what it truly means to be part of this brotherhood. The patch passed from his hand to hers. She turned it over in her palm, the stitching rough against her skin. She pinned it to her uniform silently, the number weightier than any medal could ever be. Later that evening, she stood before the class herself. No fanfare, no speech prepared. She only told them one truth. There will come a moment when orders and ethics collide, when the chain of command tells you one thing and your conscience tells you another. In that moment, remember this: we measure ourselves not by the missions we complete, but by the people we refuse to abandon. The class stood silent, absorbing her words in the dim light. Most would forget them in the blur of exhaustion and training, but one wouldn't. One young woman lingered after the others were dismissed. She approached cautiously, her eyes sharp but hesitant. "Captain," she said softly, "weren't you afraid?" Frost studied her. The question wasn't naive, it was honest. Afraid of what? Of the consequences, defying orders, court-martial, death. Frost thought of the ridge, of Beckett's voice steady in her ear, of the men crawling toward helicopters they never should have seen. She thought of the silence that would have haunted her if she'd obeyed. "I was more afraid of living with the alternative," she answered quietly. The young woman's eyes widened and Frost saw it, recognition. The lesson had landed where it needed to. Time moved on. A year passed, then 2. The war shifted. Leaders came and went. But Frost remained, her limp a quiet shadow behind her steps, her presence a reminder that some rules could be broken and still serve something greater. On the anniversary of Nurstan, she stood at Arlington National Cemetery. She always did. The crowds gathered, families carrying flowers, children holding photographs, widows standing silent with flags clutched to their chests. Frost moved among them quietly, unnoticed, until she reached the rows where the names of special operators were carved into white stone, men who had not made it home. She bowed her head, because though her 480 had lived, others had not, and she carried them too, always. "Thought I'd find you here," a voice said gently. She turned. Secretary Lancaster stood a few feet away, his car parked discreetly at the edge of the grounds. His face had aged since the ceremony, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of a man who weighed every life against decisions others made from safety. "I come every year," Frost said simply. "I know," Lancaster replied, "just as I know you visit Section 60 on the anniversary of Coringal." She said nothing. He was right. She still visited the graves of the 2 Rangers who hadn't made it out of her first defiance. 2 she hadn't been able to save. 2 that had haunted her choice at Nurstan. "The President wants me to ask you something," Lancaster said. "A new joint task force. Specialized extractions. Denied territories. Places where conventional wisdom says rescue is impossible. We want you to command it." Frost's eyes flicked back to the families gathered among the stones. "And the rules?" "One rule," Lancaster said. "We leave no one behind, ever." Her silence stretched. The weight of the decision settled on her shoulders. She thought of the ridge, of the helicopters, of the patch stitched with the number 480. Finally she nodded once. "When do I start?" 6 months later she stood in a briefing room, 20 operators before her. SEALs, Rangers, Delta, Pararescue, even international allies. Each hand-picked not just for skill but for something rarer, moral courage. The unit you're joining doesn't exist, she told them. Neither will the missions, but we all understand the truth. Human lives are not acceptable losses. Master Chief Beckett stood at her side, older now but still hers, still the voice at her shoulder. What do we call ourselves? One operator asked, half smiling. She touched the patch on her uniform. Black background, white number, silver words. Officially nothing, she said. But among ourselves, 480, that should be enough. They dispersed, preparing for their first mission. And Frost lingered, staring at the satellite imagery of the terrain ahead. This time, she thought, no one would have to stand alone. What happens when the world says, impossible, and one voice says, try anyway? The briefing room was quiet, too quiet for 20 hardened operators about to step into the unknown. The air carried the tension of men and women who had seen death and survived, but who understood what this mission meant. They weren't just risking their lives. They were risking the system's wrath, the same system that had nearly buried 480 SEALs alive under a label called acceptable losses. Frost stood at the head of the room, her limp subtle but undeniable, her uniform crisp. She didn't need a microphone. Her presence carried louder than any amplifier. 48 hours ago, she began, her voice steady, 2 CIA operatives vanished in the mountains east of Kandahar. The extraction team was recalled. Washington has already written them off as operational casualties. A ripple passed through the room. Every man and woman there knew what that phrase meant. The same words that had almost killed her brothers. The same words she had defied. Frost let the silence stretch, her gaze cutting through them. We disagree with that assessment. A screen lit up behind her, satellite imagery glowing with ridgelines and choke points. Enemy presence here. Anti-aircraft here. Intelligence suggests the operatives are alive, but they're running out of time. She paused, then said the only words that mattered. We're going to get them. For a moment, no one moved. And then Beckett, now her executive officer, the same man who had sat beside her on the ridge, cleared his throat. Wheels up in 30. You heard the major. Let's move. They moved fast, packing gear, checking weapons, strapping armor. Their faces carried no bravado, only the grim calm of people who knew that courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, measured, and steady. The aircraft roared into the night, 2 modified MC-130 combat Talons hugging the earth as if they belonged to it. Inside, the operators sat in silence, checking and rechecking their kit. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at nothing. Frost stood at the front, briefing again, her voice low over the engine noise. Local forces have mobilized, borders closed, airspace denied. Washington considers this mission prohibitive. They're wrong, but we'll succeed for one reason: we refuse to accept failure. She paused, letting her eyes sweep the dimly lit faces. Those 2 operatives down there, right now, they believe they're alone. Our job is to prove them wrong. The red light inside the aircraft snapped on, bathing the cabin in crimson. 2 minutes to drop. Frost strapped on her chute, her movements practiced, efficient, betraying no hesitation. She looked back at her team, gave a single nod. Remember, she said, we don't measure ourselves by the missions we complete. We measure ourselves by the people we refuse to abandon. The green light flashed. She stepped into the void. The night swallowed them. Wind tore across their faces as they plummeted silently, the earth rushing up to meet them. At altitude, the world was nothing but air and darkness. At low opening, silence. Their parachutes bloomed with minimal sound, carrying them down into hostile terrain. They landed in the shadow of the mountains, the team assembling like ghosts in the night. Frost led the way, her limp softened by training, her rifle cradled close. The compound was ahead. Intelligence had been right. The operatives were there, barricaded inside a crumbling structure. Rebel forces had them surrounded, checkpoints dug in across the ridges, waiting for dawn to move in and finish the job. Team Alpha, Frost whispered into comms. Overwatch, positions here and here. She pointed to high ground. Team Bravo with me, we're going in. They moved like shadows, silent, deliberate. Overwatch set up with suppressed weapons, their scopes scanning for threats. Frost and Bravo team crawled through drainage culverts, slipping under enemy lines until they emerged inside the compound. The door cracked open under her hand. Inside, the two operatives sat in the dark, weapons trembling in hands that weren't meant to fight wars. Their eyes widened when they saw her. "United States military," she said quietly. "We're here to get you out." The older of the two shook his head in disbelief. "We were told no one was coming, that we'd been written off." Frost's expression didn't change. Someone was wrong. She crouched, scanning the room, counting bodies. How many need medical evacuation? How many can walk? The operative stammered answers as the team moved efficiently, distributing gear, prepping for the escape. Outside, Overwatch whispered updates. Movement increasing, patrols circling closer. They're getting restless. Frost keyed her comms. Package secured, requesting extraction, Point Bravo, 15 minutes. The voice came back tense. Negative, rebel forces en route to Bravo, extraction compromised. Frost recalculated instantly. Redirect to Point Charlie, alert QRF. They moved fast, too fast. The rebels knew something was wrong. Shouts cut through the night. Searchlights swept the compound, beams slicing across the dirt. "Contact," Overwatch whispered. "They've spotted movement." Frost didn't break stride. "Team Alpha, diversion west side. Team Bravo with me. We move east. Go." Gunfire cracked as Alpha opened up, drawing attention away from the evacuees. Frost led the column, weaving through the darkness. She didn't fire unless she had to. When a patrol stumbled too close, she raised her silenced sidearm and eliminated them in 2 quiet beats. Every second stretched. The evacuees stumbled, exhausted, terrified. Some had to be dragged, their legs barely holding them upright. The clearing loomed ahead, wide enough for a Talon to land, safe enough only if they reached it before the rebels did. But the sound behind them grew louder. Shouts, gunfire, the pursuit had begun. "Move faster," Frost ordered, her voice calm, her pulse steady. They broke into the clearing just as the Talon's engines thundered overhead. Its shadow swept across them, wheels touching down in the dirt. The ramp dropped, light spilling into the night. "Form perimeter," Frost commanded. Her team spread out, rifles raised, holding the line as evacuees were rushed aboard. The rebels burst through the trees, fire blazing. The night lit up with muzzle flashes. Task Force 480 answered with precision, their weapons disciplined, their shots exact. No waste, no panic. "Go, go, go," Frost urged, waving the last operatives up the ramp. She was the last in the clearing. Bullets cracked around her, one grazing her arm, another snapping inches from her leg. She fired back, covering her team as they fell back into the Talon. Beckett reached out from the ramp, shouting over the chaos. "Major, time to go." She turned, fired one last burst to suppress the rebels, then ran. Beckett caught her arm, yanking her inside as the ramp lifted and the aircraft roared skyward. Inside, the evacuees huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes wide. One of them, the older man who had spoken earlier, stared at her in disbelief. "We thought we were dead." Frost leaned against the bulkhead, her arm bleeding, her chest heaving. She looked at him steadily. "Not while we're out here." Hours later, they landed at a secure base. The evacuees were whisked away to medical tents. Frost's team disembarked in silence, their exhaustion etched deep, but their pride unspoken. Waiting on the tarmac was Admiral Lancaster. His eyes swept over the team, then settled on her. "You were supposed to notify me before departure," he said. Frost's expression didn't change. Communications issue, must have been atmospheric interference. For the first time in a long while, Lancaster almost smiled. 67 people who would be dead otherwise. Hard to argue with that. That's what we do, Frost replied. When everyone else says impossible, we find a way. That night, long after the base had quieted, Frost stood alone in the hangar. The Talon loomed before her, dust still clinging to its hull. She rested her hand against the metal, her thoughts distant. 5 years since Nurstan, dozens of impossible missions, hundreds of lives saved. All because one night on a ridge, she had decided not to obey. And as her secure phone vibrated with the signal of another mission, she straightened, the limp barely noticeable anymore. Duty called, and she would answer. Because some rules deserve to be broken. What happens when those who carry rifles are called to save those who cannot fight back? The alert came at night, not from the Pentagon, not even from the chain of command. It came directly to Frost's secure line. A coded message, its urgency disguised in clipped phrases only she and a handful of others could read. Humanitarian compound, Sierra Leone. Civil war reignited, borders closed, airspace denied. 27 aid workers, 40 patients. Execution threatened at dawn. She read it twice. The words were clinical, but the meaning was clear. Abandon them, write them off. Operational casualties. She didn't hesitate. By the time Admiral Lancaster's office stirred, Task Force 480 was already wheels up. Beckett sat across from her in the aircraft, his arms crossed, a half-smile tugging at his face. He's going to chew us out for not waiting. He'll get over it, Frost said, strapping her gear. They won't. The operators sat around her, silent, focused. Some had been with her since Nurstan. Others were newer, drawn by the legend but hardened enough to understand the truth. There was nothing glorious about what they did, just necessary. She briefed them over the roar of engines, her voice carrying without effort. Rebel forces have surrounded the compound. They've given the aid workers a choice: surrender the patients or face execution. They refused. That means we don't have hours. We don't even have minutes to waste. She paused, scanning their faces. Rules of engagement are defensive. We're here to extract, not escalate. But make no mistake, if they threaten those people, we respond with overwhelming precision. The red light flashed overhead. 2 minutes to jump. The cabin bathed in crimson, shadows flickering across hardened faces. Frost pulled her chute straps tight, then took her place at the head of the line. She didn't look back at Beckett, didn't need to. She knew what he'd say if she asked. Always right behind you. The green light flared. She stepped into the dark. The world swallowed them, the air rushing cold across their faces. For seconds, there was nothing, just the plunge into silence. Then the canopies opened, whisper-soft, guiding them down into hostile ground. They landed just beyond the perimeter, their boots sinking into damp earth. The night smelled of smoke and fear. Frost crouched low, raising her scope. Heat signatures glowed across the compound, rebels packing, waiting. Dozens, maybe more. Team Alpha, she whispered into comms, set overwatch on the ridges. Silencers only, no alerts. Team Bravo with me. Drainage culvert east side, we go in quiet. They moved like shadows, slipping under the nose of the enemy. Minutes later, Frost pushed through a splintered doorway into the compound's main building. Inside, the scene was desperate. Men and women in medical scrubs clutched makeshift weapons, pipes, scalpels, even a broken chair leg. Patients lay on cots, too weak to move, their faces drawn tight with fear. When they saw her, disbelief rippled through the room. "United States military," she said softly. "We're here to get you out." A doctor, gray hair matted with sweat, stepped forward. "We were told there would be no rescue." They were wrong. Frost's tone was flat, certain. "We move now." Outside, a whisper came through comms. "Movement on the perimeter. They've noticed something." "Alpha, create a diversion west side," Frost ordered. "Keep them focused away from us." Gunfire cracked in the distance as Alpha opened up, drawing rebels toward the wrong side of the compound. Frost led the evacuees out the east, guiding them through shadows. Patients too weak to walk were lifted by her operators, cradled like children. But the noise grew, shouts, boots. The rebels weren't fooled for long. Faster, Frost urged, her voice calm, unshaken. Stay low, stay close. The extraction point was still 10 minutes away. Too long. Beckett's voice cut through tight. They're closing fast. The evacuees stumbled, panic breaking through their exhaustion. Frost raised her rifle and fired a short burst into the darkness, dropping 2 advancing figures. The rest scattered for cover. Keep moving, she said. The clearing appeared ahead, just wide enough for the aircraft. Engines thundered overhead as the Talons approached, rotors straining against the heavy night air. The ramp dropped, light spilling across the evacuees. Form perimeter, Frost commanded. Her team spread wide, rifles steady, as aid workers and patients were rushed aboard. And then the rebels broke through the tree line. Gunfire ripped across the clearing. Bullets sparked against metal, tore into dirt. Patients screamed as they were shoved onto the aircraft, medics dragging them aboard. Task Force 480 returned fire, controlled, precise, surgical. Frost stood at the edge of the ramp, rifle braced, firing steady bursts to cover the last evacuees. A bullet grazed her arm, tearing fabric, drawing blood. She didn't flinch. Last group aboard, Beckett shouted. Go, Frost snapped. But she didn't move. Not until the final evacuee was inside. Not until the line was clear. Only then did she back toward the ramp, firing until her magazine clicked empty. Beckett grabbed her arm, yanking her inside as the ramp slammed shut and the Talon lifted into the night. Inside, chaos swirled, patients sobbing, aid workers clinging to each other, medics working frantically. Frost sat against the bulkhead, her rifle across her lap, her arm bleeding freely. The doctor from before crawled toward her, his voice trembling. We thought we were alone, that no one cared if we lived or died. Frost looked at him, her face calm, unreadable. You were. The aircraft roared across the sky, breaking free of hostile airspace. Hours later, it landed on a secure strip, far from the war zone. The evacuees were rushed to safety, medics swarming them. Frost's team disembarked in silence, exhaustion written into every line of their bodies. Lancaster was waiting, his arms folded, his expression caught between anger and relief. You were supposed to notify me before departure, he said flatly. Must have been atmospheric interference, Beckett muttered with a smirk. Frost met Lancaster's eyes. 67 people would be dead if we'd waited. That's all that matters. Lancaster studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. That's what you do. When everyone else says impossible, you prove them wrong. Later, when the base had gone quiet, Frost stood alone in the hangar, staring at the aircraft that had carried them. Her arm was bandaged, her uniform stained. She rested her hand on the metal skin of the Talon, her eyes distant. 5 years since Nurstan, dozens of missions since, hundreds of lives pulled back from the edge. And still the weight pressed on her, not the weight of what she had done, but of what she could never stop doing. Because somewhere, right now, someone else was being written off. Someone else was being called an acceptable loss. Her phone vibrated, another mission, another impossible. She straightened, her limp softened by habit, her resolve untouched. Duty calls, she murmured, and stepped into the night. What happens when defiance becomes doctrine? 2 years after Nurstan, the military still whispered her name. Frost, the sniper who had broken orders, who had turned operational casualties into 480 men walking. She was legend now, but legends are double-edged. Some saw her as savior, others saw her as danger. In Pentagon halls, officers debated her existence like a problem that couldn't be solved. She undermined command authority. She saved lives. She risks precedent. She set the right precedent. And still, outside those walls, Task Force 480 moved quietly across continents, invisible to headlines, carving corridors through impossible terrain. Rescues that weren't supposed to happen, extraordinaries no one would admit to. Each time the team left their mark only in silence. They came in shadows, and when they left, those who had been written off stood breathing again. The world rarely knew their names, but inside the Brotherhood of Special Operations, a new rule began to spread. No one left behind isn't a slogan, it's a promise. Frost felt it ripple in small ways first. Training manuals rewritten, briefing rooms where the word acceptable losses caught in throats, instructors at Coronado holding up a black patch with white embroidery, 480. No one left behind. It wasn't official, not yet, but it was becoming culture. And culture, she knew, was harder to kill than orders. One evening, she returned from a mission and found Lancaster waiting in her office. He had traded the suit of Secretary of Defense for the uniform of an admiral again. A quiet signal that he wanted to be part of the fight, not just the politics. "You've changed more than you realize," he told her. His voice wasn't congratulatory. It was wary, almost cautious. "Every branch is watching Task Force 480. Some are rewriting their playbooks to mirror yours. Others resent it. They think you're building a cult of disobedience." Frost leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady. "We're building accountability, a promise that no one is disposable." He studied her. "Do you know what the Joint Chiefs call you in closed sessions?" She didn't answer. "The conscience they can't control." For a moment silence hung between them. Then she spoke, her tone even measured. "Conscience shouldn't need controlling." Weeks later, she stood at a podium at the Naval Special Warfare Training Command. The hall was filled with fresh SEAL candidates, men and women who had survived the crucible of training. They looked at her as if she were a story come alive. She didn't waste words. "You've been taught to follow orders," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "To trust the chain of command, to believe in the system. These are good things, necessary things." She paused, letting silence settle. "But there will come a moment when the system fails, when orders and ethics collide, when protocol tells you to abandon someone and your conscience tells you otherwise." Her hand unconsciously brushed her leg, where the limp from Nurstan remained, a scar stitched into her every step. "In that moment, remember why you're here, not to follow blindly, but to serve something higher, not just the mission, each other." The room was silent, no applause, just the weight of her words sinking in. Afterward, a young lieutenant approached her, nervous, sharp-eyed. "Ma'am, is that how you knew, in Nurstan, that it was worth defying everything?" Frost looked at her, recognizing herself years ago, before the ridge, before the ghosts. "I didn't know I could save them," she said. "I just knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." The lieutenant swallowed, the lesson etching itself into her eyes. That night Frost stood on the training grounds alone, the sea air biting, the sand cold under her boots. She thought of the ridge, the muzzle flashes, Beckett's voice steady in her ear. She thought of the silence in Washington that had sentenced 480 men without lifting a hand. And she realized something quietly terrifying. She wasn't just training warriors anymore. She was training dissent, not loud rebellion, not reckless defiance, but the kind of conscience that knew when rules bent too far away from humanity. It was what had saved them once. It was what would save them again. But it came with a cost. Politics sharpened against her. Rumors of investigations. Quiet threats about command authority. Whispers of court-martial resurrected, only to be silenced by the fact that she was untouchable now, her record too heavy with victories. Still, the pressure pressed, and she felt it most in the solitude between missions, when the weight of those she hadn't saved pressed louder than the cheers of those she had. At Arlington, she walked again among the stones, not for herself but for them, for the Rangers in Coringal, For the ones in Nurstan who hadn't survived even her defiance, for the families left standing alone. She paused at one stone in particular, her hand brushing the cool marble. The name etched there belonged to a ranger she hadn't reached in time years ago. His mother stood nearby, her hand resting on the grave. She looked at Frost, recognition flickering in her eyes. "You were there," the woman said softly. "Not accusation, not anger, just truth." Frost nodded once. The woman's eyes filled, but her voice didn't break. "You tried." Frost swallowed but said nothing. Some words weren't meant to be answered. That night when she returned to base, Beckett found her sitting alone, her patch in her hands. 480. No one left behind. "You carry too much of it," he said quietly, lowering himself beside her. She didn't look up. "We all do." He shook his head. "No, we fight, we bleed, we do the job, but you carry all of it. Every name, every face, even the ones no one else remembers." She let out a breath, sharp, tired, because someone has to. The room fell quiet again, and Beckett knew he couldn't take it from her. He could only sit there the same way he had on the ridge, beside her, steady, silent. Weeks later, Task Force 480 was activated again. Not soldiers this time, not even aid workers. Children. 32 orphans trapped in a warlord's compound in the Horn of Africa, scheduled to be used as bargaining chips in a conflict no one in Washington wanted to touch. Diplomatically unfeasible, the cables had said. Frost read the words and something cold pressed through her chest. Children, written off by men who would never see their faces. She looked at her team gathered in the hangar. "They're already calling it impossible," she told them, "so it's ours." Beckett gave the faintest of smiles, as always. The mission began before the ink on the cables had dried. And as they lifted into the night sky, Frost sat in silence, her rifle across her knees, her hand brushing the patch on her shoulder. No one left behind. Not ever again. What does it mean to win a war if you lose your humanity along the way? The question pressed against every step of Frost's limp as she moved down the darkened ramp of the Talon. The night was humid, thick with the smell of dust and diesel. Ahead, through the infrared scope, the compound came into focus. Corrugated steel walls, guard towers, and inside, 32 children crammed into a single building, the last currency of a warlord whose name no one in Washington cared to remember. Washington had called them unrecoverable. Frost called them hers. She crouched in the sand, her team fanned out behind her. Beckett was at her shoulder, steady as always, his voice a whisper in her ear. "Guard rotations every 90 seconds. 2 RPGs here, machine gun nest there. We'll need precision. Fast in, fast out." Frost didn't blink. "Alpha Overwatch, Bravo breach with me, no mistakes, no noise." They moved like shadows, sliding across the sand, slipping through the blind spots the warlord's men thought they had secured. When the breach charges blew, they weren't thunderclaps. They were whispers, muffled and precise, just enough to peel open the wall. Inside, the air was hot, stinking of sweat and fear. The children huddled together, wide-eyed, silent. None screamed, none cried. Survival had already taught them silence. Frost dropped to one knee, lowering her rifle. She pulled off her helmet so they could see her face. "United States military," she said softly. "We're here to take you home." The oldest, a boy no more than 12, stood shakily, putting himself between her and the smaller ones. His hands shook, but his chin lifted. She looked at him and felt something break inside. That was courage, raw, untaught. "We're not leaving without you," she said, her voice steady. The boy hesitated, then nodded once, and the room exhaled. Her team moved fast. Each child lifted into arms, carried with a gentleness none of them had known for years. Frost took the smallest herself, a girl no older than 4 who clung to her neck silently. But outside the night erupted. Shouts, floodlights cutting across the compound. The breach hadn't gone unnoticed for long. Gunfire cracked. Bullets tore into the metal walls. Task Force 480 formed a shield around the children, firing back in controlled bursts, every shot precise. "Move," Frost commanded. Her voice was iron. "Keep them low, keep them close." They sprinted through the breach, rebels surging from the barracks. Beckett fired, dropped two. Another came up with an RPG, but Alpha from the ridge silenced him with a single round. The clearing loomed ahead. Engines thundered, the talons sweeping in low, ramps dropping, dust churning the night. "Go," Frost shouted. "Get them aboard." Her team formed a corridor of fire, holding the rebels back as the children were rushed up the ramps. The girl clung tighter around Frost's neck, her small body trembling. Frost shifted her rifle one-handed, firing bursts as she ran. The last child stumbled and Beckett scooped him up, sprinting toward the ramp. Frost covered his back, her rifle barking, emptying a magazine, then another. "Everyone's on," Beckett roared. "Confirm," Frost snapped, her voice sharp. A pause, then a voice in her ear, calm, steady. "All 32 aboard." Only then did she run. She turned, firing one last burst, then leapt onto the ramp as Beckett pulled her in. The aircraft lifted, engines screaming, bullets pinging off its armored skin. Inside, the children huddled together, eyes wide, clinging to each other. The girl in Frost's arms buried her face against her chest. Frost looked down at her, feeling the weight of something she hadn't felt in years. Not just responsibility, but hope. Hours later, when they landed at a secure strip, the children were carried out into the waiting arms of aid workers. Some wept. Some simply stood, stunned, not believing safety was real. Frost disembarked last, her limp more pronounced now, blood seeping through her sleeve where a round had grazed her again. Beckett stayed at her side, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lancaster was there, watching from the edge of the tarmac. His eyes swept over the children, then back to her. For once, he didn't say anything about protocols or notifications or clearance. He only said quietly, "You changed what this means." She gave him a look that wasn't defiant, wasn't humble, just steady. It was never supposed to mean anything less. Months later, she stood again at Naval Special Warfare Training Command, this time not as guest but as instructor. A class of candidates sat before her, men and women sharp-eyed, exhausted, but burning with that same hunger she remembered in herself. Her limp was still there. The scar still pulled at her arm when the weather changed, but her voice carried unshaken. "You've been taught to fight, to endure, to obey. But hear me, there will come a moment when none of that is enough, when the choice isn't between success and failure but between conscience and obedience." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, finding each face. "In that moment, remember this. Rules exist to serve principles, not the other way around. And the highest principle is simple. No one left behind. Not ever." The room was silent. No applause, no words, just the weight of something larger than doctrine settling across them. Later, as the candidates filed out, one young woman lingered. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Major Frost, weren't you afraid? In Nurstan, in Sierra Leone, with the children tonight, weren't you afraid of failing?" Frost studied her for a long moment. She thought of the ridge, of 480 men rising from the valley because she had refused silence. She thought of 2 CIA operatives pulled from a compound that had been written off. She thought of 32 children, safe now, their faces pressed into her memory forever. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But fear doesn't matter. What matters is finding something more important than fear, and holding to it." The young woman nodded slowly, her eyes widening as if the lesson had finally reached where words alone couldn't. That night Frost stood alone again, in the hangar, in the silence, her patch catching the dim light, 480, no one left behind. She touched it once lightly, then turned toward the night sky where another mission waited, another impossible. And as she walked, limp, steady, eyes forward, The thought came not as comfort, not even as pride, but as truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.